Lonely rancher found a bride at auction, only to learn she was his brother's widow. Samuel Garrett paid $47 for a wife at auction, thinking loneliness had finally found its cure, until she whispered 3 words that shattered his world. "I'm Margaret Garrett." His dead brother's wife stood before him like a ghost made flesh, carrying secrets that would either destroy them both or heal wounds that had festered for 3 long years in the unforgiving dust of the frontier. The dust had been falling for 3 days straight, coating Millfield like a burial shroud. Samuel Garrett stood at the back of the courthouse steps, his hat pulled low, watching the auctioneer's gavel rise and fall with the rhythm of a woodpecker against dry oak. This was his 3rd time here, the 3rd time he'd worked up the courage to bid on a wife. The first woman had gone to the banker for $63. The second to a cattle rancher from the next county, over for $48. Both times, Samuel had kept his hands buried deep in his coat pockets, his mouth dry as summer creek beds, unable to raise even a finger when the moment came. But loneliness had a way of eating a man from the inside out, like termites in good timber. 5 years he'd worked his ranch alone. 5 years since Thomas died in that terrible winter, taking with him the only voice that had ever called Samuel's name with anything close to love. The silence in his cabin had grown so thick he sometimes spoke aloud to his coffee cup just to hear something other than the wind through the rafters. Now, another woman stood on the platform. She was different from the others, not because she was prettier, though the afternoon light caught her dark hair like honey on a spoon, but because of the way she held herself, straight back despite the shame of it all. Her chin lifted not in defiance, but in the quiet dignity of someone who'd already lost everything that mattered. Margaret O'Sullivan, the auctioneer called, his voice carrying over the murmur of men below. Aged 26. Good health. Can cook, sew, and manage a household. No children to speak of. Samuel felt something stir in his chest. She reminded him of someone, though he couldn't place who. Maybe it was the way her hands were folded, calm and steady, or the way her eyes seemed to look right through the crowd to some distant horizon. The bidding started at $10. A blacksmith raised it to $15. The owner of the grain store made it $20. Samuel's hands stayed deep in his pockets, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. $50. 35. 40. The woman's eyes swept the crowd then, and for just a moment, they found his. There was no pleading in them, no desperate hope, just a quiet acceptance that made his chest ache. She looked like someone waiting for a train she didn't particularly want to catch, but knew she had aboard anyway. $42, called the grain store owner. Samuel's hand moved before his mind could catch up. 45, he heard himself say, his voice carrying farther than he'd expected. The crowd turned to look at him. Some recognized him, the Garrett boy who'd kept to himself since his brother passed. Others whispered behind their hands, wondering what a man like him was doing bidding on a wife when he barely came to town except for supplies. 47, countered the grain store owner, mopping his brow with a handkerchief. Samuel stepped forward, his boots echoing against the courthouse steps. The woman's eyes found his again, and this time he saw something flicker there. Not hope exactly, but perhaps the faintest spark of curiosity. $50, Samuel said, his voice steadier now. A murmur went through the crowd. $50 was more than most of these auctions brought, more than a good horse or a month's supplies. The grain store owner looked at his wallet, calculated something in his head, and shook his head. Sold to Samuel Garrett for $50, the auctioneer announced, bringing his gavel down with finality. The woman, Margaret O'Sullivan, didn't smile. She simply nodded, as if she'd expected this outcome all along. Samuel walked to the front of the crowd, his legs feeling strangely unsteady, and counted out the bills from his leather wallet. His hand shook slightly as he handed the money to the clerk. "Congratulations, Mr. Garrett," the clerk said, stamping the papers. "She's all yours." Samuel turned to face his new wife. Up close, she was even more striking. Not beautiful in the way of painted ladies or dancing girls, but handsome in the way of good leather or polished wood. Something built to last, to weather storms. "Ma'am," he said, touching the brim of his hat. She studied his face for a long moment, her head tilted slightly, as if trying to place him. When she spoke, her voice was soft but clear, carrying the faint trace of an accent he couldn't identify. "Thank you," she said. Then, after a pause that seemed to stretch like taffy, she added, "You remind me of someone." Samuel's throat tightened. "Someone good, I hope." Her smile was sad and distant, like sunlight through storm clouds. "Someone I loved very much." They walked to his wagon in silence, the dust swirling around their feet like whispered secrets. Samuel helped her up onto the seat, her hand light and cold in his. As they drove out of town, he stole glances at her profile, trying to shake the feeling that this moment was somehow familiar, as if he'd dreamed it before. It wasn't until they were halfway to his ranch, the sun beginning to sink toward the mountains, that she spoke again. This time, her voice was barely a whisper, carried on the evening wind like a prayer or a confession. "My name isn't really O'Sullivan," she said, her hands folded in her lap. "It's Garrett, Margaret Garrett." Samuel's hands went slack on the reins. The wagon slowed to a stop in the middle of the dusty road, and somewhere in the distance, a hawk cried out against the dying light. Thomas's wife, his brother's wife, whom they'd all believed dead these past 3 years. The woman he'd just bought at auction was the ghost that haunted every corner of his lonely house. For 3 days, they lived like strangers in a house built for ghosts, until she accidentally called him by his dead brother's name, and the coffee cup shattered against the kitchen floor. In that moment, surrounded by broken porcelain and spilled dreams, the widow of Thomas Garrett finally told Samuel the truth about the winter that took everything and the long, bitter road that led her back to the only family she had left. 3 days passed like a careful dance between two people afraid to step on each other's feet. Margaret moved through Samuel's kitchen with the quiet efficiency of a woman who'd learned to make herself small, useful, and unnoticed. She cooked his meals without asking what he preferred, mended his shirts without being told they needed fixing, and swept the dust from corners that hadn't been cleaned since Thomas died. Samuel watched her from the doorway each morning, coffee growing cold in his hands. She knew where everything was: the good skillet hanging behind the stove, the salt crock on the second shelf, the drawer where he kept his only sharp knife. Her hands moved with muscle memory, reaching for things in places she shouldn't have known to look. Because this had been her kitchen once, hers and Thomas's. The realization hit him fresh each time, like walking into a spider web in the dark. She'd cooked breakfast for his brother in this very room, had probably stood at that same window, watching the sunrise paint the mountains gold while Thomas read his newspaper at the table Samuel now sat at alone. On the 4th morning, she made flapjacks. Not just any flapjacks, but the ones with a touch of molasses that Thomas used to beg for on Sundays. Samuel recognized the smell before he even came down from the loft, sweet and rich, carrying memories he tried to bury along with his brother. "Where did you learn to make those?" he asked, settling into his chair. Margaret's hands stilled over the stove. She didn't turn around when she answered. "A woman I knew. She said they were her husband's favorite." The lie sat between them like a loaded gun on the table. Samuel cut into his flapjacks and tasted the past. Sunday mornings when Thomas would eat 3 helpings and complain about his belt getting tight, when laughter came easy and the future stretched out endless as the prairie. "They're good," Samuel said quietly. "I'm glad." After breakfast, she washed the dishes while he read yesterday's newspaper. The silence wrapped around them like morning fog, thick and comfortable until Margaret reached for the coffee pot to pour herself a cup. "Would you like more, Thomas?" The words slipped out soft and natural, the way a person might say good morning or bless you after a sneeze. Samuel's head snapped up from his paper just as Margaret's hand went to her mouth, her eyes wide with horror. The coffee cup fell from her fingers, shattering against the wooden floor in a spray of porcelain and brown liquid. The sound echoed through the kitchen like a gunshot, and in the ringing silence that followed, Samuel watched his brother's widow sink into the chair across from him, as if her legs had given out. "I'm sorry," she whispered, staring at the broken pieces. "I'm so sorry." I don't know why. Because you loved him. The words came out harsher than Samuel intended, but they needed saying. Margaret's head jerked up, tears threatening at the corners of her eyes, and he saw his brother's face reflected there. The same green eyes, the same stubborn tilt to the chin when cornered. Yes, she said simply. I loved him very much. Samuel set down his newspaper and looked at the broken cup, at the coffee spreading across the floor like spilled blood. Tell me what happened, Margaret. Tell me how you're here when we buried an empty coffin 3 winters ago. She was quiet for so long he thought she might refuse. Then, in a voice barely louder than the wind through the eaves, she began to speak. The fever came in December. Started with little Annie first. She was only 4, had the sweetest laugh you ever heard. Then it took the baby, then Thomas. Her hands twisted in her lap like she was wringing out laundry. I nursed them best I could, but the snow was too deep to get to town, and we'd run out of medicine weeks before. Samuel closed his eyes, picturing his brother wasting away in some cold cabin while he'd been here, warm and ignorant, wondering why Thomas hadn't written. I buried them behind the house when the ground thawed. 3 little graves in a row. Then I packed what I could carry and started walking. Walking where? Anywhere that wasn't there. Margaret's voice cracked like old leather. I couldn't stand the quiet anymore. Couldn't bear waking up each morning and remembering they were gone. So I left and ended up at the auction. She nodded, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. Ran out of money in Kansas. Ran out of hope before that. A woman alone doesn't have many choices, Samuel. I was lucky that auction block was all I had to face. Samuel stood up and fetched a dish rag from the sink, kneeling to clean up the spilled coffee and broken porcelain. Margaret started to protest, to take the rag from him, but he held up a hand. Let me, he said. As he worked, gathering the pieces of the shattered cup, he thought about the empty coffin they'd buried in the town cemetery. The headstone that read, Thomas Garrett, beloved brother. How many nights had he stood there in the dark, talking to nothing but dirt and regret? You could have come here, he said without looking up. After. You could have come to me. You didn't know me, Samuel. Thomas barely talked about his family, and when he did, she paused, choosing her words carefully. He said you two weren't close anymore. That stung, mostly because it was true. Samuel and Thomas had quarreled the last time they'd seen each other. Something stupid about money and pride that seemed laughably small now. Thomas had ridden away angry, and Samuel had been too stubborn to follow. Too proud to write first. We weren't, Samuel admitted, dumping the broken pieces into the slop bucket. But you were his wife. That would have been enough. When he looked up, Margaret was crying quietly, tears streaming down her cheeks like rain on a window. She looked so much like Thomas in that moment. The same way his brother used to cry when he was frustrated, angry at himself for showing weakness. I didn't know where else to go, she whispered. And when I saw your face at that auction, for just a moment, I thought. She shook her head. You look like him, you know, around the eyes. Samuel's chest ached like someone had reached inside and squeezed his heart. He understood now why she'd seemed familiar, why her presence in his kitchen felt both foreign and right. She was carrying Thomas with her, in her memories, in her gestures, in the way she made flapjacks with molasses on Sunday mornings. Margaret, he said gently, what are we going to do now? She looked at him across the kitchen table. This woman who was his wife-in-law, but his brother's wife in truth, and for the first time since the auction, she almost smiled. I suppose, she said, we're going to figure out how to live with ghosts. The storm came, without warning, trapping them together in a root cellar while lightning split the sky like God's own fury. And in that cramped darkness, with thunder shaking the earth above their heads, Samuel Garrett did something he'd never done before. He reached for his brother's widow's hand, and she didn't pull away. What happened next would either damn them both or finally set them free from the ghosts they'd been carrying. The storm came without warning, as prairie storms often do. One moment Margaret was hanging laundry on the line behind the house. The next she was watching a wall of black clouds roll across the horizon like an army of the damned. The wind picked up so suddenly it nearly knocked her sideways, whipping her skirts around her legs and sending the wet sheets snapping like battle flags. Samuel burst out of the barn at a dead run, his hat flying off his head. "Root cellar!" he shouted over the rising wind. "Now!" Margaret abandoned the laundry and ran. Behind them, the sky split open with a crack of thunder so loud it seemed to shake the bones in her chest. The first raindrops hit like thrown stones, cold and sharp against her face. Samuel grabbed her hand and pulled her toward the small wooden door set into the hillside behind the house. The root cellar was barely big enough for two people, but it was solid, built by Samuel's father to withstand the worst the prairie could throw at them. They tumbled inside just as the sky opened up in earnest. Samuel pulled the door shut behind them and dropped the wooden bar into place, sealing them into darkness so complete Margaret couldn't see her own hands. "Storm cellar lamp should be." Samuel's voice was muffled, followed by the sound of fumbling and a muttered curse. "Here!" The match flared, briefly illuminating his face, all sharp angles and worried eyes, before he touched it to the wick of an oil lamp. Golden light bloomed around them, revealing shelves lined with preserved vegetables, sacks of potatoes, and the tools of survival that kept a ranch family fed through the long winters. Margaret pressed her back against the rough wooden wall, suddenly aware of how small the space was. Samuel sat across from her on a wooden crate, his knees almost touching hers in the cramped quarters. Above their heads, the storm unleashed its fury, rain drumming against the cellar door like 1,000 angry fists, wind howling like all the lost souls of the prairie. "How long do these usually last?" Margaret asked, wrapping her arms around herself. Despite the summer heat outside, the underground space was cool and damp. "Could be an hour, could be all night," Samuel said, settling back against his own wall. Nothing to do but wait it out. Lightning flashed somewhere overhead, the brief illumination leaking through the cracks around the door. The thunder that followed was so loud Margaret felt it in her teeth. She flinched involuntarily, and Samuel noticed. "You afraid of storms?" "No," she said, then reconsidered. "Maybe a little. Thomas always said they were just God rearranging the furniture upstairs," but her voice trailed off as she realized what she'd done. Brought Thomas into this small space with him again, his memory settling between them like an uninvited guest. Samuel was quiet for a long moment, listening to the rain. When he spoke, his voice was softer than she'd ever heard it. He used to say that when we were kids, too. During the bad storms, when I'd hide under the bed, Thomas would sit right outside the door and tell me stories about God moving his piano or dragging his rocking chair to a better spot by the window. Margaret looked at him in the lamplight, seeing something she'd missed before. "You were afraid?" "Terrified." Samuel smiled, but it was edged with old pain. "Thomas was the brave one. Always was. I was just the little brother who jumped at shadows and cried when the thunder got too loud." Another crack of lightning lit up the cellar, followed immediately by thunder. This time, Margaret didn't flinch. She was too busy seeing Samuel in a new light, not just as Thomas's younger brother or the lonely rancher who'd bought her at auction, but as a boy who'd once been afraid of storms while his older brother told him stories to keep the fear at bay. "He never told me that," she said quietly. "Thomas liked people to see the best in him. Even me, toward the end." Samuel picked at a splinter on the wooden crate he sat on. "Truth is, I was jealous of him most of our lives. He got the charm, the easy laugh, the way with people. He gestured at himself with a self-deprecating smile. "Whatever this is. Thomas used to say you were the smart one," Margaret said. "Said you could fix anything broken, build anything from scratch. Said you had hands that could coax life out of dead ground." Samuel looked up at her, surprise flickering across his features. "He said that, among other things." Margaret shifted on her improvised seat, a sack of flour that crinkled under her weight. "He was proud of you, Samuel. Worried about you, too, especially after your parents died. He wanted to come visit, bring the children to meet their uncle, but I was too stubborn and proud to welcome him." Samuel's voice was thick with regret. "Too angry about some stupid argument I can't even remember now." The storm raged on above them, but something had shifted in the small space. The air felt different, charged with more than just the electricity of the tempest overhead. "What were you angry about?" Margaret asked gently. Samuel was quiet, so long she thought he might not answer. When he did, his voice was barely audible above the rain. "He left," Samuel said simply. "After Ma and Pa died, Thomas couldn't wait to get away from his place. Said it held too many sad memories that he needed to make his own way. But this ranch was all I had left of them, and I couldn't understand how he could just walk away from it." From me, Margaret felt something crack open in her chest, a pain so sharp and familiar it took her breath away. "You thought he was abandoning you, wasn't he?" "No." The word came out fiercer than she'd intended. "Samuel, no. Thomas left because he was suffocating here, not because he didn't love you. He talked about you all the time, worried that you were alone, wondered if you were eating enough, if you were happy. He wanted to write, but he was afraid you'd tear up his letters unread." Samuel's head jerked up, his eyes bright in the lamplight. "I would have read them. I would have read every damn one." He didn't know that. "You Garrett men aren't exactly known for your communication skills." Margaret's smile was sad but fond. "Thomas thought you hated him for leaving, and I thought he didn't care enough to stay." Samuel laughed bitterly. "We were both fools." Another flash of lightning, another roll of thunder, but this time neither of them paid it much attention. They were too caught up in the strange intimacy of shared grief, the way old wounds could finally start to heal when exposed to the right kind of light. "Margaret," Samuel said carefully, "what are we doing here?" "Really?" She met his eyes across the small space, seeing her own confusion reflected there. "I don't know," she admitted. "When I saw you at that auction, for just a moment, it felt like Thomas had sent me an angel. Someone who would understand what I'd lost. And now I'm not sure if we're helping each other heal, or just keeping each other's wounds from closing." The storm was beginning to move away, the thunder growing more distant, the drumming of rain against the door softening to a gentle patter. Soon they'd have to leave this small, safe space and return to the world above, to the careful politeness and shared silences that had become their daily routine. But for now, in the golden circle of lamplight, with the storm as their witness, Samuel did something that surprised them both. He reached across the narrow space and took Margaret's hand in his. Her fingers were cold, callous from work, but they fit against his palm like they belonged there. She didn't pull away, didn't flinch or make excuses. She just looked down at their joined hands with something like wonder. "I think," Samuel said quietly, "we're two people who've been carrying ghosts for too long. Maybe it's time we learned to set them down." Margaret squeezed his hand, her thumb tracing across his knuckles in a gesture so gentle it made his chest ache. "Maybe," she whispered, "but what if we're not ready to let them go?" Above them, the storm rolled away across the prairie, leaving behind the sweet smell of rain-washed earth and the promise of clearer skies. But in the root cellar, two hearts that had been frozen in grief for too long began, tentatively, to thaw. Samuel found the letter hidden in his brother's old coat. 7 pages of words Thomas never got to send, confessing regrets that could break a man's heart and a love that reached across the grave itself. But it was the last line that changed everything. "If something happens to me, promise you'll take care of Margaret. She's got enough Garrett stubbornness to survive anything. But even the strongest souls need someone to come home to." The morning after the storm dawned clear and bright, the air washed clean and smelling of sage and wet earth. Samuel woke before sunrise, as was his habit, but this time he lay still in his narrow bed, listening to the sounds of Margaret moving around in the kitchen below. The soft scrape of the coffee pot against the stove, the gentle thud of firewood being added to the fire. Sounds that had once meant Thomas was home, and now meant something he wasn't quite ready to name. He'd lain awake most of the night thinking about her hand in his, the way she'd looked at him in the lamplight like she was seeing him for the first time. They'd walked back to the house in comfortable silence when the storm passed, but something had shifted between them in that root cellar. The careful distance they'd maintained was cracking like ice in spring. Samuel dressed and climbed down from the loft, expecting to find Margaret at the stove as usual. Instead, She stood by the window, still in her nightgown and wrapper, staring out at the damage the storm had left behind. A section of the barn roof had torn loose, and the old oak by the creek had split down the middle, its massive trunk cleaved as neatly as if struck by God's own axe. "Bad one," Samuel said, moving to stand beside her. "I've seen worse." Margaret's voice was distant, thoughtful. "The night Thomas died, there was a storm like that. I kept thinking the thunder was him, trying to tell me something from wherever he'd gone." Samuel studied her profile in the morning light. "What do you think he was trying to say? That he was sorry, maybe, for leaving me alone?" She turned to look at him, and he saw she'd been crying. Not the desperate tears of fresh grief, but the quiet weeping of old wounds finally allowed to drain. "Samuel, I need to tell you something." "All right. Yesterday, in the cellar, when you took my hand." She paused, gathering her courage like a woman about to jump across a dangerous creek. "I didn't think about Thomas. For the first time in 3 years, I felt something that had nothing to do with him, and it scared me." Samuel's chest tightened. "Margaret, let me finish." Her voice was steady, determined. "I married you because I didn't have any other choice, and you married me because you were lonely. But somewhere along the way, something changed. At least for me." She was quiet for a long moment, and Samuel found himself holding his breath, afraid to move or speak and break whatever spell was settling over them. "I think," Margaret said carefully, "I might be falling in love with you. Not because you remind me of Thomas, but because you're nothing like him. Because you're kind where he was charming, steady where he was restless, patient where he was quick to anger." She looked down at her hands, twisted in the fabric of her wrapper. "And that feels like a betrayal of his memory." Samuel reached for her then, his calloused fingers tilting her chin up until she met his eyes. "Margaret, loving someone new doesn't mean you love Thomas any less. How can you be so sure?" "Because I've been falling in love with you too, and it doesn't feel like betrayal. It feels like—" He searched for the words, thinking of seeds planted in ground that had lain fallow too long, like coming alive again. The kiss that followed was soft, tentative, nothing like the desperate passion of young lovers. It was the careful touching of two hearts that had been broken and were learning to trust again. When they broke apart, Margaret rested her forehead against his, and Samuel could taste salt on his lips. Her tears or his, he couldn't tell. "What do we do now?" she whispered. "I don't know," Samuel admitted, "but I know what I want to do first." He took her hand and led her up the narrow stairs to his loft. Not to his bed. That would come later, when they were ready, but to the old trunk that sat beneath the eaves, filled with things he'd never had the heart to throw away. "I've been meaning to go through Thomas's things," he said, lifting the heavy lid. "The clothes he left here, some books, a few letters I never read." He pulled out a familiar brown coat, worn soft with age. This was his favorite. Mom made it for him the year before she died. Margaret touched the fabric with reverent fingers. "He wore it the day we were married." Samuel nodded, then frowned as he felt something crinkle in the inside pocket. He reached in and pulled out several folded sheets of paper, yellowed with age. His name was written on the outside in Thomas's careful script. "What is it?" Margaret asked. Samuel unfolded the pages, his heart beginning to race as he recognized his brother's handwriting. "A letter. To me." He looked up at Margaret, confusion and hope warring in his chest. "It's dated 2 weeks before he died." They sat together on the edge of the bed, the letter spread between them like a bridge across time. Samuel's voice shook as he began to read aloud. "Dear Samuel, I've started this letter a dozen times and thrown it in the fire. Just as many. Pride is a damnable thing, isn't it? Ma always said the Garrett men had too much of it for our own good. I know you're still angry about our last fight, and I don't blame you. I said things I shouldn't have, accused you of things that weren't true. The ranch was never a prison to me, Samuel. You were never a burden. I left because I was a coward, not because I didn't love you. I was afraid I'd end up like Pa, bitter and broken by the hard years, taking my disappointments out on the people I loved most. I thought if I could make something of myself somewhere else, I could come back worthy of the brother who'd always been better than me. Margaret is with child again. If it's a boy, we're going to name him Samuel. She says it's time I stopped carrying guilt around like stones in my pockets and made peace with the best man I've ever known. If something happens to me, and out here, something always could, promise you'll take care of her. She's got enough Garrett stubbornness to survive anything. But even the strongest souls need someone to come home to. I love you, little brother. I always have. I'm coming home this spring, and I hope you'll have me. Your brother, Thomas. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of Margaret's quiet sobbing. Samuel's hands shook as he folded the letter carefully, his vision blurred with tears he'd been holding back for 3 years. He was coming home, Samuel whispered. He was going to name the baby after me. Margaret reached for him then, and they held each other while the morning sun streamed through the loft window, warming the dusty air around them. For the first time since Thomas died, Samuel felt something other than regret when he thought of his brother. He felt forgiveness for Thomas, for himself, for the words that had been left unsaid too long. He knew, Margaret said into his shoulder. Somehow, he knew we'd find each other. Samuel pulled back to look at her, this woman who'd been his brother's wife and was becoming something entirely new to him. Not a replacement for what he'd lost, but a gift he'd never expected to receive. Margaret Garrett, he said, tasting her name like a prayer. Yes. Would you marry me? Not because you have to, not because you need somewhere to go, but because you want to. Because we want to build something together that's ours alone. Her smile was like sunrise after the longest night. I thought you'd never ask. They were married again 3 weeks later by the circuit preacher, this time in the church with the whole town watching. Margaret wore her mother's dress, altered to fit, and Samuel wore his father's good suit, pressed and mended with loving care. As they spoke their vows, real ones this time, born of choice rather than desperation, Samuel felt Thomas's presence not as a ghost haunting their happiness, but as a benediction on their new beginning. His brother had kept his promise after all, in the only way he could. He'd sent Samuel someone to love, someone to come home to, and in the years that followed, when their children played in the same fields where Samuel and Thomas had once run wild, when Margaret's laughter filled the house that had been quiet too long, Samuel would sometimes find her reading Thomas's letter by lamplight, tears on her cheeks but peace in her eyes. "What are you thinking about?" he'd ask. "How love doesn't end," she'd always answer. "It just finds new ways to grow." And Samuel, holding his wife close while their children slept safely in their beds, knew that Thomas would have been proud of the garden they'd grown from the seeds of shared sorrow. A love that honored the past while embracing the future, strong enough to weather any storm the prairie could send their way.